One of the things you've been speaking and writing about is Christian extremism.
And the undercurrent of extremism is uncertainty. It gives black and white solutions to an uncertain world. I am scared, and so I want power, and this person gives me power to protect my way of life.
You said, I spent my entire career trying to defend their homeland, and then people took the capital and they were not saying Allahu Akbar. They were saying, Jesus is Lord. How did we get there? Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values and principles of a very wide range of people shaping our common life. I'm delighted to be joined today by Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth is a lifelong senior Homeland Security official. She served as Deputy Chief of Staff for the Department of Homeland Security in the first Trump administration, and prior to that had a long and distinguished career. She's an expert really on radicalisation, extremism and violence prevention, which she still works in. And I'm really, really grateful for you sparing the time out of your busy day to speak to me.
I'm delighted to be with you, Elizabeth. This has been a long time coming, and I'm a huge fan of your work as well, and I'm grateful to have the chance to spend time with you.
Me too. I think, therefore, you won't be shocked by my first question. What is sacred to you?
What is sacred to me? My faith is sacred to me. It wasn't always. It was something that I came about the hard way. I have one of those stories where I was raised as a Christian in a Christian home. I knew all of the facts, and through a series of challenging times, came to be broken and find that he was there, and he pulled me up and put me back together again. And it has been, we're coming up on 20 years since that moment. And every day, every week, I find more and more to be just eternally grateful for his care for me. And then I would say my other sacred is my children, my family. I'm just extremely blessed in the goodness there, and that's probably in the tangible, the things that I get to touch. That's the thing that I treasure.
And let's dig down into maybe principles and values. And all of this language is contested, but I'm really interested in kind of the things that people are trying to live for, and I was going to say, and would maybe die for. I think that's often not what's asked of us, but that orientation, and particularly if there's anything in that kind of principles and values that you've found has guided your decisions, right? When you faced a fork in the road in life and you had to choose to go one direction or the other, what have you used to help you figure out the way forward?
That's such an interesting question. And it's funny, I'm a part of a fellowship group that's exploring the nature of civil society. It's with the Aspen Institute, and we were just together in South Africa studying apartheid and post-apartheid in South Africa. And one of the readings that we did, we were challenged with, what are the things you would die for? And I have to say that our room was kind of quiet, because the reality is that we have been so blessed in our age where that's not usually on the table as something that we have to consider. They did take off of our, the list of things that we could say. We couldn't say our children. And I'm like, come on, that's the easy thing.
That's my one.
Yeah, exactly. When I do remember when my son was born, I was like, oh, I get it. I would instinctually do just about anything to protect them. But the other stuff is a little bit more it's cognitive, and you have to dig, and you're playing a what if and a hypothetical, right? So if certain scenarios presented themselves, would you be willing to take the risk, and in what context? And my personal value system is first and foremost about obedience to the Lord. Now can be a really hard thing to figure out. There's a lot of gray space in our life, and certainly in serving in government. There are times when there are no good answers, especially in national security. By the time you're getting something up to the level of, my last role in government was as Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism. And so you're frequently at the table presenting and debating options that are going to get presented to the President of the United States. And I like to remind people who haven't had the experience, if you are sitting in a situation room discussing something, it means that there's no easy answer. It's not always obvious. We have lots
if it
of
gets
frameworks.
that far, no one lower down the chain felt able to make this call.
Correct. So I tend to, be careful in my critique of anybody serving in government. We don't always know all the facts. And the truth is, in that room, you don't always know what you want to know. Like, there's a lot of, you're making decisions based on imperfect data. So I don't want to come across as trite that obedience to the Lord is like the only thing. Like, there's a lot of gray in making decisions and figuring out what is the right thing to do here. But in general, I think the principles that especially in I don't know, the last decade, have started to really deeply value is integrity. Be truthful about what you know and what you don't know. Don't pretend. And I think especially I've been wrestling with, as Americans, or any democratic country where you have a vote, we are bearing some responsibility for those who we put in office, who are making decisions that then are impacting human beings. And so when our governments are acting in a way that is violating those values, like integrity or offering dignity to human beings, then there's a responsibility that we the people have to hold elected officials accountable, because it's a reflection on me as a voter, how a government law enforcement agent is treating an immigrant. So I think one of the, going back to what are you willing to die for, like there is this moment that my country is currently in that is very, very different from anything I, in my 40 plus years have experienced, and that injustice that we're watching at the hands of the government is calling, those values to question. Okay, so if my values are being violated by my government, what is my response? What is my calling here? And that's definitely a very live question for me.
Yes, thank you. I just want to name the fact that we have listeners from all kinds of different political perspectives, people of different religions, people of no religion, people who just don't know what they think about these questions. And I'm sort of storing away in my mind that some people might be thinking, I don't know what it means to be led by God, but maybe we'll be able to unpack a little bit of that and help people into your world a little bit. Perhaps if you start telling me a little bit about your childhood, because you were raised in Texas, in the Bible Belt, which is this phrase that British people kind of have some associations but don't really understand what it is. Could you just paint me a picture of your world when you were growing up, maybe elementary school age? What were you walking around doing, seeing, thinking?
So in elementary school, I attended a Christian school. So that meant that there were Bible classes in school, meant that we opened the day with prayer. We wore uniforms. And of course, they're all the normal subjects. And it was a college preparatory school, so it wasn't, just about teaching the Bible. It was all the other academic subjects as well. My family attended church.
Are there some schools which are not that?
Well, there are maybe some schools that water down their curriculum or feed their curriculum through such a strong biblical lens that it might not be teaching what the preponderance of mainstream society believes are the facts or the current understanding of our scientific knowledge. it varies state to state how much flexibility a private school has. And today, it was kind of starting when I was in elementary age, but today there's a pretty strong homeschool movement, and the curriculums there vary in terms of their rigor and their academic standards. So, I'd like to clarify that I attended more of an academically rigorous school, but it was also a Christian school that we definitely studied the Bible and were taught a biblical worldview. And my family, we were active in attending church, but not between my dad's career and his kind of his disposition. He's very introverted, and has what we like to phrase in Christianese, like a very discerning spirit.
I have no idea what that means.
So there was a lot of, like, this isn't good enough, so we would try different churches. And
I see.
So we eventually, I think my mom says that, like, at some point we were getting close to high school. She's like, we got to pick a place and just stay there because the kids need some stability. But it's funny because in reflecting back, actually, in the work that I did for my book and trying to understand, like, why the Christian culture has really gotten engaged with politics. There was a point in my life where I was like, I'm not okay with this. And why was I able to see that, but others weren't? And I actually hearken it back to a bit of my childhood experience where I had a father who would question authority. And he did not just assume that the pastor had it all together. And he did not assume that, every church is perfect. And so that kind of built into me, it's okay to question authority, that we're all men trying to do the right thing, men in the generic term, and that we make mistakes, and we need to hold people in authority accountable. And that turns out not to have been quite the norm in the rest of the culture that, say, my peer group was in. So the people I was going to school in were in cultures that were much more just accepting that, you don't question. Deferential. That's a great, the pastor is almost always right. Everything in your world should revolve around your church. So I was in that culture, but I wasn't fully subsumed by it, which probably has been helpful in my adult life, trying to better understand why parts, not all, of the mainstream evangelical church have become more subsumed by politics and co-opted by coerced, all of the words that there's parts of our church that are just very melded and interwoven with politics now, that in a way that I don't think that our scripture teaches. I do think that upbringing is part of the reason I was able to see it, and so many haven't.
So one of the things you've been speaking and writing about is essentially what you quite straightforwardly call Christian extremism. And we will come back to that question for you of, like, how did the community that I grew up in end up where it is, or parts of it end up where it is. But you use this phrase, like, I was brought up in a world where I was very strongly part of a team, and there were the other guys, and they were a threat to our way of life. Could you just unpack that statement for me so we're understanding how that was forming you?
Yeah. And it's actually what I was doing there was comparing my own experience to, in my professional world, like how we define extremism. And extremism is when a group or an individual perceives a threat to their success or survival by some other group of people, the outgroup, and comes to the conclusion that therefore the only answer is hostile action. So it's not just having that polarized lens of us, them, I don't like them, or they're threatening me, so I'm going to go vote. That's not extremism. Now, it's unhealthy. I don't think we should always be looking at our political opponents as a threat to us. That's definitely not a good place for us to be in as a society. But for a percentage of people, which is actually a quite large percentage of people right now in the United States, there are many who think that hostile actions are only choice. And so when I was reflecting on like, how do you get there? How do you get a group of people to be in constant fear that they are under threat? And it really does come back to for decades now. If we're in Republican, conservative, Christian evangelical circles, and I want to be clear, there's a part of the American church that is not conservative. There's very strong and healthy parts of the church that would vote for a Democrat or that would consider themselves a liberal or a moderate. The church is very big and broad, but statistically speaking, there are more people that consider themselves, or when they check the box on the survey, check the box Christian, that also tend to vote for Republicans. And that's been the case for a couple of decades now. There was a big sort in the 1970s, and it's been trending that way. So when people often think of, a Christian in America, they're kind of making a lot of assumptions. Oh, they're going to vote for Donald Trump. Oh, they're going to be a Republican. They're going to be conservative. And there is actually a not small number of people that don't at all fit that mold. But let's just give the stereotype its due and recognize that like there is a sizable portion that do fit that. And the question is, how did that happen? And I think how that happens is you give people through their politics a strong dose of fear over many, many years. There's a moment at which when that fear becomes fairly real to you and somebody comes along and says, you know what, voting isn't the only answer. Like we've got to be stronger. We got to push back harder. And we need somebody like a Donald Trump who's willing to be, break all the rules. And I think everybody on both sides of the political spectrum in the United States would say that Donald Trump is his own man. He does not fit any of our traditional political molds. And so that's kind of how you get a movement of people who in the 1990s were so convinced that Bill Clinton, because of his actions in office with an intern, having an affair with an intern in that was so disqualifying and he needed to be removed from office. How do you go from that to somebody who arguably lived his life in such a way that he was braggadocious about his sexual affairs, and nobody batted an eye? Like it is in 20 years, the same group of people changed their value systems quite a lot. And the answer is fear. I'm scared, and so I want power, and this person gives me power to protect my way of life. And that's kind of the trajectory that, at least in the United States, that conservative thread of the church has been involved in.
How much do you feel you received that narrative when you were growing up?
I certainly was indoctrinated into it. I was for those who know anything about American culture, like I grew up listening to Rush Limbaugh. Fox News started in my high school years and college, and so I was constantly consuming Fox News. Now, I do think the Fox News of the 1990s is very different than the Fox News today, but nevertheless, like you can be absolutely a pure journalistic outfit, and still the purpose of the news is to tell you kind of scary things. And so if that's all you're consuming, you're eventually getting your body into this state of like you're constantly used to the fear, and then you're in this hyperactive state of vigilance and trying to protect yourself. And we now understand a whole host of harms. It's not good for us to be in that constant state of fight or flight, both from a physical perspective as well as a mental health perspective. And societally, it creates a pretty significant polarization where we assume the worst of people who disagree with us. And there's a whole host of studies from More in Common and other groups who have been trying to better understand why are we so polarized? Why do we think really badly of our opponent, even though they don't actually hold the beliefs we think we hold? So yeah, for me it's deeply personal because I was in that movement for quite a long time, and like I also came up that I was in that media ecosphere and then worked in the George W. Bush administration. And the hallmark of what he ran on, which was disrupted by 9/11, but what he ran on was compassionate conservatism. The gentleman that helped craft that for Governor Bush at the time is a man named Marvin Olasky, who has been a journalist, and he also happened to be the elder at my church. And so like there was like this strong tie for me of like, oh, we can do government compassionately, and we can do things well, even as a conservative, and still care for people. And so that was like, there was already cognitive dissonance for me because from a policy perspective or from my faith perspective, I believed it wasn't wrong to care for the poor. And were quite a few more maybe libertarian style people in the conservative movement who were like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, right? And so there was always that tension in any sort of large tent political movement. But it really was almost like I came out of being indoctrinated, Rush Limbaugh, Fox News. I move into the George W. Bush camp, if you will. I was on his campaign. I worked in his administration. And when I, left service, this is around 2007, my view of what it meant to be a Republican was heavily informed by George W. Bush and his speechwriter, Pete Wehner. And then I stepped back out because, just to be clear, when you go into government service, like it is moves so fast. You don't have time to keep up on pop culture. Like, it's so funny to me when the two stints of government service, people will be like, you remember that thing? And I'm like, well, when did that happen? And they'll tell me a date. And I'm like, nope, I'm not going to remember.
I was in the tunnel.
It's completely right. So I was in this tunnel and I come out, and the Republican Party had already started to pretty drastically change. And so there was, at that point, some cognitive dissonance for me. Now, the 2008 election was like a John McCain versus Barack Obama. So it really, McCain is still, he was considered a maverick in the Republican Party, but he was still a quintessential Republican, as was Mitt Romney. You don't really see what started to take hold in 2008 until Donald Trump comes on the stage. But it turns out that thread of the party was always there and gaining power. Largely, the 2008 financial crisis is probably the main contributor to them being on the ascendance. But for me, it was like those threads were always there, and there were factions that were pushing those narratives. I just didn't think that they had that kind of power, and it took me by surprise when it showed up in 2015.
Yeah. Let's pause for a minute. I just want to get personal with a few questions to get a bit more of your hinterland. What would surprise people about you?
Oh, that's a good question. I love hiking 14ers. 14ers are mountains in Colorado that are over 14,000 feet. Don't ask me to translate that to meters.
It's fine.
Really
we
bad.
used a very confused mixed system. People recognize 14,000 feet.
Okay. So that's my happy place, is to get out into the mountains. That's part of the reason we moved to Colorado, was so that I could get out and be in the mountains.
No, this is a question I want to ask. Who do you want to be becoming, but you are not allowed to say Jesus? You have to use a descriptor. What kind of person do you want to be becoming?
Listen, that's a tough question.
It's the question.
It is the question. Well, you took Jesus off the table, so now I have to think more deeply, because that's a good shorthand. I have two answers. One is like, my children are in the house for another 6 years, and it is amazing to me how quickly, like, you have children yourself, like when they're little, you're like, oh my gosh, this is never going to move.
Ease
Like
up.
this is a lot. These are long days. And now I just blink and my teenage son has grown 2 inches and I'm just like, what has happened? So I'm very focused on how to help them grow into the man and woman that I think they are capable of being. And so like it's part of my answer is being present in my home and available to them and investing in them because they're going to go away soon. And I get weepy thinking about it. So that's one answer is like, who do I want to be? I constantly get pulled by many different things that I'm involved in. And like, I try to keep that first and foremost, that's my top priority is being present for whatever their needs might be. And then the second is, I'm leading in several capacities in volunteer work and in my day job. And so I guess I am constantly looking at what it looks like to lead as a non-anxious presence in a very difficult world, uncertain world. And so being able to offer hope when some of the things we're working on, there isn't actually, from a worldly perspective, it's kind of irrational to be hopeful. And leading in that context is where I find myself investing a lot of prayer time, a lot of thought time, reading, talking to other leaders, and trying to figure out how to be able to encourage those whom I have the privilege of leading to keep pressing on and to keep doing good work because the work we do and it matters.
So we have this picture of you growing up in a Christian school in Texas in a kind of default kind of background culture, as we all do. And then you went into government, as you said, and then ended up with this long, extremely serious, high-level career in national security, trying to prevent extremism. What was the trigger for that?
9/11. So when I went in to the Bush administration, I was working on that compassionate conservative agenda that I mentioned. There was an office at the Housing and Urban Development Department that I worked at for a year, and then the Department of Education. But in the middle of all of that, 9/11 happened. I was there in Washington, D.C. I had a friend at the White House. There was a period of time that we didn't know what was happening. There were still planes in the sky. I was 22 years old. Very, very scary, formative moment for me. And the older I get...
You were in the building?
I was not in the White House. My roommate was in the White House.
Wow.
So I was in D.C. at actually the Housing and Urban Development Department. We were evacuating, which took like 6 hours to get out of the city. It was crazy how panicked everybody was. I mean, people were taking off their heels and just walking for miles to get out of the city. And of course, the news is doing their best to try to keep us informed. Our cell phones weren't working. There was no such thing as a smartphone at that time. So we were entirely dependent on radio or TV. And if you're stuck in the car trying to get somewhere, so you're listening to the radio and you're hearing there's something that's happened at the State Department. There's still planes in the sky. If you're at the Capitol and you need to evacuate, the White House is evacuating. It for an hour and a half, it felt like you didn't know if we were going to make it. And as an 20 plus years later, you can look at it and go, yes, that was really scary. But in particular for my generation, that was very formative. It was in a way that people 10 and 20 years ahead of me, I'm not saying it didn't affect them, it did. But it was forming in a way that was just very, very jarring. And it's, for those of us that lived through it, many of us were like, whatever it takes, I just don't want to live through that again. Like that was one of our darkest days. And so you've heard, like, I had people from my high school that went into the military. They were not planning on doing that, right? And I have any number of us that were in doing politics were like, forget the politics. Where can I be of help? So I ended up taking a job as the assistant to the Homeland Security advisor. And it, I was one of those young somethings that was like, oh, I don't want to answer a phone. I want to do substantive work. But also, you're kind of like, whatever it takes, if that's what they need help with, I'm going to answer the phone. Turned out to be an amazing gentleman who has since passed, but became a mentor of mine. Being in that office then transitioned me to continue working on the Homeland Security Council in a policy capacity, where I'm working with former and current special forces out of the military, CIA, FBI, Secret Service, like all of our, soup of acronym agencies that they have practical experience. Most of them were operators and didn't like to write, and policy work is a lot of writing. So they would like tell me what the problem was, tell me like what they want to do to fix it, and I was like their scribe, and I would translate it into policy speak. And so I ended up indoctrinated into the Homeland Security discipline that we were building in the moment in real time, and learning from these operators firsthand what it really is like on the ground. And that's kind of what set me into this trajectory of Homeland Security work, which today, if you want to go into the Homeland Security field, you go and get a degree, and you're going to take classes from people like me who will tell you what it was like back in the day. But at the time, like, there was no such thing as a Homeland Security discipline. So we were literally writing it as bombs are falling in Afghanistan, trying to figure out how do we protect our country at home. And lots of mistakes were made, of course, and we learned from them. Some of us did, and the field has evolved and is much, much more mature than it was back then. But that's how I ended up in this space. It was 9/11, and it was this shaking of like, I don't want this to ever happen again in our country, and I will do whatever it takes to support us from having to relive that.
So I think I'm really hearing for the first time what a fracturing of the story that the nation had been telling about itself was. Because I think, I grew up with the IRA in the background, right? The idea that actually America didn't really know what it was like to have terrorism in its own country is a whole new way of looking at this for me. That seems like a very recent development.
Well, and it's funny because if you actually look at far right extremism, we had the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, which was an anti-government extremist, Tim McVeigh. There were Al Qaeda attempts on the World Trade Center in 1993. So it's not like we were impenetrable or hadn't had moments. It's just that I think there is something about 9/11 that like nobody in the country felt untouched, because it was so, it wasn't just a bomb going off in one building in a way that was isolated. It was planes in the sky. And so like as the planes are landing, because just for those that didn't live through it, there's this period of time where like the first plane hits and we don't actually know what happened, and we didn't know we were under attack. The second plane hits and then it's like, oh, we're under attack. This was intentional. It was a blue sky day. There was no way that this was an accident twice into the same two, twin towers. Then the third one hits in Washington, and you're like, where else could it come? And so they had already started to, they had put a ground stop. Nobody could take off, but there were multiple planes in this, thousands of planes in the sky, and they needed to get them all on the ground. And so they're, actively working to get them on the ground, but there was 2-3 hours before everything was grounded. And so while my husband was in Chicago at the time, and they evacuated that city because they were worried that they were going to hit the Sears Tower. So anybody with proximity to an icon of the United States felt like, oh my gosh, it might come for us too. It was very, very, very different than just hearing like, oh my gosh, there's a tragedy in Oklahoma City. How could somebody do that? Because it was this multiple vector, lots of unknown for a period of hours. Everybody's glued to their TV, wondering are they going to come for? I remember we had panic over water. We had panic over are they going to be in our subway systems? We envisioned that this enemy was way more capable and powerful than they actually turned out to be because of how spectacular the attack was. And yeah, it was. But to your point, the impenetrable nature of the United States, we are kind of take a punch, get back up, and keep moving. And we don't. I'm watching it now in the space of mass shootings. If you statistically look at the number of shootings, the number of people who've died, the lethality, and you were to tell somebody in 1995, this is what it's going to look like in 2025, they would not believe you and or would just be like, oh my gosh, how do you guys function? That is insane how frequently you're having to deal with this. And yet we have a school shooting, somebody dies, and the next day it's not a top news story because we're so desensitized and numb to it. So there was something about 9/11 that broke through that numbing and
the sort of social psychological trauma of that moment. You've really helped me understand it at a deeper level and understand why you would be driven then to give as much as you did of your life to these extremely demanding, extremely senior jobs where you're essentially, and I enjoyed your book so much, well, enjoy is probably too strong, but I learned so much from your book about extremism and radicalisation and what drives violence, what drives people from tipping over in from the ideas that the other guys are the enemy to the acting against them. And I learned that most extremists, particularly people who commit violent acts, they're not disproportionately more suffering from mental health. That's a myth. Mm-mm. That was helpful. They're also not necessarily people who've poverty and social disadvantage, not that well evidenced in the driver. Could you say there was sort of 4 or 5 things that are very strongly evidenced as driving people to extremism? Could you say what they are?
Yeah, what we know about people that mobilize and there's 2 pieces that a lot of the original studies were focused on people joining groups. That's because Al-Qaeda, ISIS, that they were group organized terrorist groups. And then in more recent years, a lot more focus on the lone actor attack, which is what the United States mostly suffers from these days. But even ISIS and what they carried out in Europe was largely this amalgamation of group affiliation and lone actor, because it was ISIS inspiring people to just go take matters into their own hands. And so what we know is that usually when you look back into an attacker's life, they've experienced some sort of significant loss of maybe a humiliation. It could be a group humiliation or it could be a personal humiliation. And so there's just a sense of loss of significance, a loss of or a lack of belonging, often a crisis moment in their life. So that could be a loss of a loved one or a loss of a job. So it's a grievance that's probably been there for some time that's triggered by a crisis. And then the other piece here that we know is kind of in the undercurrent of extremism is uncertainty. Anytime you have periods in history of great uncertainty, the extremist narrative comes in and serves a coping. It becomes a coping mechanism where you're like, I can tell you why you're dealing with this problem, and it gives black and white solutions to an uncertain world. So it's for certain personality types, it can be very tempting to be like, yes, it's those people that are the reason I lost my job. It's that political party that has created such a cultural rot that has led my faith to be under attack. And it oversimplifies complex problems and offers a simplistic solution of hostile action. Now, a lot of people participate in that narrative journey and don't necessarily buy that you have to commit some sort of hostile action. But I think it's important to note that hostile action doesn't have to be criminal. That if you look at the spectrum, lower end of the spectrum are things like bullying, harassment, threats, and intimidation, some of which sometimes in certain cases can get you into criminal or civil penalties. But generally speaking, that's like the civil society space that we really don't want government policing. And what we can say post-COVID with like great certainty is that all of those things, harassment, intimidation, threats, and bullying, have gone through the roof. I think it's peaked. I think it's starting to level off, but I don't know if we're going to come back to the pre-COVID norm of what was expected in civil society. That, for example, if you're not happy with what's happening at your school board, you don't follow one of your school board representatives out of the meeting and keep yelling at them all the way to the car and then say, I know where you live, which was happening really frequently during the COVID period. So like there was this norm breaking for us that kind of has filtrated throughout society. We just have less patience for one another. And so we're more likely to kind of cross that threshold into that hostile action. Now, just because you yell at somebody or you're bullying somebody doesn't mean you're going to go kill somebody, right? That's a huge leap there. But what we do know is that when you have more people participating in that lower end of the spectrum, you're going to have, it's always a small percentage that move to criminal activity, but a large whole small percentage, you're going to have a larger number of people moving into criminal activity. And that upper end of the spectrum includes things like maybe vandalism on the lower end of the criminal side, hate crimes, but it eventually moves into terrorism and genocide being the upper end of the hostile action spectrum. So all of this being fed by a narrative of those guys, them, are threatening us. And it's an oversimplification, right? It's something has gone wrong for you in your life. You have an unmet need, usually a belonging or significance, that is leading you to come to the conclusion that other people are to blame and I should do something about that.
Yeah. So reading your work around that really, really made me, this is an aside, but it really made me think about how all the stuff I'm interested in, which often gets coded as soft, like effective parenting, community building, helping people feel seen and acknowledged, the way spirituality builds resilience to uncertainty. You can make a very strong argument it's the opposite of soft, right? Like that is violent. That's violence prevention. That is terrorism prevention. And this, like, I was writing down all these drivers and then I was like, it's a lack of love. That's what it is. It's a lack of love. Like people who do not know themselves beloved are vulnerable to violence. And just thank you for helping me like put that together properly for the first time. I want to just fill in a few bits of your story. And am I right in thinking that you were working in government? You both voted for Trump and found yourself working in the Trump administration or chose to work in the Trump administration? First term, I did vote for him reluctantly. I actually sat in the voting booth for a long time. Somebody was like, you really need to go. It's like, fine. And if I could go back, I wouldn't have voted for him. But shortly after he won, I got a phone call. We were living in Dallas at the time, got a phone call from a friend that had worked in the Bush administration with me and said, hey, do you want to come in? I know who to send your resume to. Now, this is a common practice for if you're in one party or the other and your party wins at the beginning of the transition. Suddenly got loads of jobs to fill. Yes, you got like 3,000 jobs you can fill. Send me your resume, right? I was like, no, we're good. We just moved to Dallas. I'm not interested. Not my guy anyway. And thanks, but no thanks. Then John Kelly was nominated as the Secretary of Homeland Security. He's a 4-star retired Marine general, has an excellent reputation. And the friend called and said, hey, this is the person that's going to be the secretary.
check him out. He's really good. You should come work for him. And I was like, he is really good. I'm so happy for the department. This is really great. No, we're still not moving. My kids are little. I'm near my family. This is not the right life stage. Also, Trump, like, not interested. And then 3 days before the inauguration, this friend called, and it was a very different tone. It was, usually in transition periods, you work really long hours, but you're excited because you're getting to, do something new and you're going into power, and this is really cool. This was despair. And this friend was like, I don't know who I can trust. There are security things that are happening. I can't tell you over this line. I need you. Can you please come in? And that, since we've already told my 9/11 story, that's the heartstring. You pull on me for a mission purpose and say you can help. I'm going to be there, right? Like, it's almost instinctual. I did have to talk to my husband, who was really not happy about the move. It took us 2 weeks to sort through things, and it's still, actually, that first year is probably, for both of us, the hardest year of our marriage, because he was very reluctant and had very deep concerns about the impact to our family, the impact to my career. He was absolutely certain that it would tank my career, and so he was trying to protect me. So that's how I ended up in the administration. And the first year was working as deputy chief of staff. The second year, I moved over to our policy shop, actually to be able to see my kids. That deputy chief of staff role is very intense. You're in really early and you go home really late. And my kids were young, so I almost never saw them. So that the second role had a slightly better life balance. But in that role was fascinating because I was overseeing the policy teams that were responsible for handling things like the travel ban and refugee resettlement and extreme vetting. So it was challenging on multiple fronts, both trying to, initially for me, sorting through, like, what's the truth here? What's the ground truth here? Like, is there a security need? How can we make the system stronger? And then, once I dug into it enough, realizing, like, actually, there's not a strong security, like, there's some tweaks here we could do that makes things stronger from a security standpoint. But this seems like we just mostly want to keep people out of the country because we don't want other ethnicities or races here. So coming to realize that some of these tools were being used and manipulated, that was hard. It was hard to figure out when to speak up, when to not, when you're like we can't. I'm a firm believer that the American people elected a president, and the president should be able to implement his policies, even if I disagree with them, as long as they're lawful and constitutional. And so my red lines became, no, you're asking me to violate the law, then the answer is no. And, if you're going to fire me over that, that's fine. I never got fired for taking that line, but some of the people up the chain did. So it definitely was a challenging time.
You've written about how hard it was and a moment when they were having presidential personnel interviews. Could you say what those were?
So the HR for administrations, for the political appointees of administrations, is called presidential personnel. Usually when you get onboarded, and in my case, it was at the beginning of the administration, they're reviewing your resume. They also ask you to better understand your loyalty. There is usually some form of, like, did you work for us? Did you support us in some way? They check whether you donated. They check your voting records if they're public. Like, they can't see who you voted for, but if you're registered as a Republican, they can see that. And I don't think I lived in states where it was that kind of, we didn't have that kind of registration. But the point is, they do those checks. Now, every administration does that part. What was weird is when I came on board, I'm assuming they did those checks. I never got asked any weird questions at that stage. In 2020, there's big transitions. John Kelly has been pushed out as chief of staff. At this point, he's chief of staff of the White House. He gets pushed out. And there are a number of other people at the White House that get pushed out. And Trump starts putting in people more like what we're seeing today in the second Trump administration that are not going to say, you're not allowed to do that. They're just going to say, yes. And sounds good. And so that's why you have so much more in the courts today than you did in the first administration, because they're doing a lot of things that are not just unprecedented, but the courts are saying, actually, that's unlawful. You're not allowed to do that. So there's that starts to take shape in 2020. And one of the changes they made is putting in a new person in that role of HR for presidential appointees. Now, this is March of 2020, right before COVID hits. And it's in the middle of an election year. So you're kind of like, why are you starting to make changes? Usually you'd wait until you might prepare things for your second term. It is not unprecedented in a second term to tell everybody to turn in your resignations, or if you've been here for 3 years, you need to move on because we want fresh people. That kind of stuff is normal. This was really weird. You only have 11 months left in the administration, and they decided that they were going to re-vet everybody that was serving of a certain level and above. And so you were going to have to go and get an interview, and you were going to be asked questions that were like probably in violation of the Hatch Act, which is one of our rules of laws that governs what a government official is allowed to say about politics. And basically was a very intense loyalty test. It wasn't, are you a Republican? Are you do you support Donald Trump? It was tell us what your most your favorite campaign slogan is. What is your favorite Donald Trump speech? Tell us what policy you're hoping Donald Trump will implement in the next administration that supports. It would be something random, like you're like the cybersecurity guy, and they're asking about, something completely off the wall that has nothing to actually do with policy. I mean, so it was a really kind of intense scrutiny that many people were like, this is weird. And then they didn't necessarily push anybody out from those experiences. But it was very clear they were getting ready for the second administration. Also, in the middle of all of this, COVID hits. And so some of the effort was disrupted. But I was kind of caught in between when this started to land. I was supposed to be moving temporarily to another role. I was getting pushed out. And they were like, well, you can go to that temporary role, but you're going to have to go through this interview. And I'm like, no. I
think I'm done.
I'm not going to lie. You're going to ask me what I think about the guy. And I mean, I'm not going to be rude, but I'm not going to lie. And therefore you're not going to let me stay. So it's just time for me to go, I think.
Yeah. And you left in 2020. And then the bit that stood out to me most clearly in your book is you said, I spent my entire career trying to defend the homeland, right? That's what I gave my life to. Defend the homeland. And then people took the Capitol and they were not saying Allahu Akbar. Yeah. They were saying, Jesus is Lord.
Yeah.
How did we get there?
Those people were lied to. I think there's, this is slightly oversimplifying, but there were two groups of people there that day. There was, we now know, a handful of people who had premeditated, intentional, probably coordinated, though the court efforts were kind of disrupted. So I don't know if we'll ever know the full story, but my hypothesis is we had a number of extremist groups that had coordinated and planned for chaos and had planned to enter into the Capitol to disrupt proceedings to prevent Joe Biden from being certified as president. Now, I don't think it was hundreds. I think we're talking about in the tens. But what we also know, and many of them are former military, so they would know this as well. It actually doesn't take a lot of people to move a riled up crowd to violence. And so what they were able to do in creating those moments was with them to get a crowd who was there in anger because they had been lied to about the outcome of the election. Once they started to see that hey, we can go into the Capitol. Hey, we can, maybe we can stop things. And so it did have a contagion effect. You had a mass effect. And that's where you end up with what we now know as January 6th. So I think there's more of a burden of responsibility on the people that did the lying, which would be Trump and his cohort, like Steve Bannon and Rudy Giuliani, the lawyers that participated in multiple cases and lying to judges. I mean, a number of them have been disbarred now. The lying is what led people to come to the Capitol that day and led them to believe that they were justified in using force to try to stop the proceedings. And in fairness, I'm talking to British audience, like, hey, we do have this history of using violence to handle our disagreements with our government. So it is in American culture that there is a point at which revolution is necessary. And so if you talk to the people that were there that day and who did go into the Capitol, that's the mindset that they have, is that every once in a while, the government is going to overstep its bounds and the people have to take it back because it is our house, right? And so they actually have a not illogical rationale. What doesn't make sense is when you see the scenes of the beatings of the police officers, like that like is heartbreaking to watch. What also doesn't make sense is the merger of there was this weird Christian nationalism on display, that somehow they were doing this on behalf of Jesus, that this was God's call. Like that piece is, in my mind, not only is it contradictory to an actual following of Jesus. If you want to really, really go deep on Jesus, you're going to find yourself in a place of there is almost no situation where Jesus will justify violence. And I actually am currently in a place of wrestling. There are a couple of people I deeply admire who will be like, yeah, governments shouldn't go to war. And I'm like, whoa, I'm a security person. I'm not sure that I think governments have different tools than individuals. And God gave us governments and there is, self-defense here. And then, you talk to some people and they love Jesus and they're on fire. And so that's really appealing to me. And they are like, no, there's never somebody strikes you, he literally means turn the other cheek. Whew. And so somewhere in the middle of that is where I sit. I'm not a complete, there's never a justification for violence. But what we actually saw on display is almost like God called us to lead in perpetrating this violence, and I just don't see that anywhere in Scripture. And so the deeper answer to your question is not just that they were lied to, but that we have people who believe that they are following Jesus and they are not well-formed disciples. So there's a soul malformation issue here, where instead of trusting in God for their protection, they're putting their hope in a man to protect them. There's definitely a deeper piece here. You don't get to a January 6th moment and you could even believe the lies and not necessarily think that many people did, by the way. Many, many, many people still believe those lies and didn't resort to violence. So there's something that's happened that's beyond just being lied to. And I think it has to do with a church that is not deep enough in our faith to understand where our true hope lies, where our protection really comes from. And so that really it's a discipleship issue.
So you use this line, I watched people from my community complete their rage-fueled metamorphosis into violent extremists. And when you left the White House, you then chose to not just leave, but to left the Department of Homeland Security. You chose to speak out quite strongly. You made an anti-Trump ad for a group called Republican Voters Against Trump. You were part of the former, what was it called? Former Homeland Security officials for Biden?
National security officials for Biden. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, former national security officials for Biden. How costly was that decision, and how's it changed your life?
Yeah, when I left government, I had no intention of doing that. I was looking for, contracting jobs at the big national security defense firms that we have in Washington. And then we had, this was also COVID. So we had that summer of 2020 where there was great unrest after George Floyd was killed. And I was watching the Department of Homeland Security get used in inappropriate ways. It actually is a precursor to what we're seeing at scale at this point in the country. And that alarmed me. Like, oh my gosh, the guardrails are falling off way faster than I expected. There was a moment, there's a square in front of the White House where for decades it's been used for peaceful protests where the people can go and most of the time, there's nobody there, and it's just a nice park. But it's also a space that for decades has been the place where the people go and let their voices be heard by the president if they disagree with something. And there were protests there, and there was a point at which the president wanted to go see a historic church that had been damaged by some of the non-peaceful protests that had occurred there. And in order to do that, instead of just clearing out the way they would normally clear out a crowd, they sent in helicopters, they tear gassed protesters. And at this point, it's daytime. There's nothing unlawful happening. Everybody is peaceful. But it was just this scene that you're like, no, we don't do that in the United States to our own people. Like, this is something has broken and then all it turned out to be, it wasn't because of a security need. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, this is getting out of hand. It was so that the president could walk across the park and hold up a Bible in front of this church. It was for a photo op. And that just so disturbed me that this is where we are, that we are, violating the First Amendment, that we're abusing, using military force in our cities. And it felt like I needed to do something. So the first thing was I reached out to a friend who had heard about this movement and former national security officials. And so I signed that letter. I thought I was done. And then I got approached to make a video, which, that was a hard decision. But ended up doing that. There were 3 of us that did speak out in that way that had served on the inside. I felt such relief after the video was out. Like, it was like, I've finally spoken the truth, and like, let the chips fall where they may. And there were chips that fell. There were a number of friends in our church group, in our family who did not understand. And they felt, I think they grouped me into 2 categories. They presumed that I was just seeking fame. And that hurt because it felt like, oh, you actually don't know me, do you? So there was that kind of disconnect. And then the other answer that I often heard was like, oh, you've lost your faith. And at that point, you start to realize like, oh, you can't handle the cognitive dissonance. Like, you are so convinced that the only way to be a practicing Christian is that you have to vote Republican. And that's nowhere in Scripture. There's no, people much deeper Christian scholars have explored this issue. Tim Keller in particular wrote a really powerful essay that summer to talk about how like being a Christian does not require you to vote one way or the other. And in fact, neither party reflects the totality of the values of Jesus. And like, there is no perfect answer here. And so I ended up, it was kind of this weird thing of there's a break in relationship that hurts. It hurts to lose friends, but it actually strengthened me in a way to say like, no, I actually know what I believe, but do you? Do you actually, or are you just following a crowd that has told you your entire life that in order to be a good Christian, you have to vote a certain way, and let oh no, that's not what our scriptures teach, and I'm hurting for you, that you've been led astray into what we call in our faith idolatry, like you're worshiping something other than God, and you're thinking that actually that thing is going to save you, and like, oh my, that doesn't end well. So it created a lot of empathy for me. At the same time, it was hard. It was hard to see relationships get broken.
Yeah. I want to finish on a question. So your book, Kingdom of Rage, is particularly addressing this question of the way Christianity has got caught up in some forms of violent extremism. And you're very straightforward that it is actually that right-wing / conservative forms of violent extremism are far more lethal and dangerous. There are forms of extremism across the map. But and the last bit I found very moving, because you were like, what does all this data and this deep research and all the things we know tell us about how in our own communities or in our own families, if we fear that someone is getting caught up in ideologies which are violent and divisive and polarizing, what can we actually do? Because we know the drivers are about belonging and love, the ostracism and the shaming and the name calling is presumably not that effective. What in kind of short form is your advice for people for how to engage across these divides?
Yeah, so there's like kind of two stages. If somebody is toying with ideologies, but they're not fully there yet, they're not fully, to use the technical term, they're not radicalized. They're just getting exposed to them. Then in that stage, you can be curious, you can ask questions, and you can insert doubt, but you do need to be careful. In particular, if you're dealing with youth, if you're the parent, you might not be the right one to tell your teen like that's a stupid idea, because they're going to react and they're going to dig in. So, like if you're dealing with teens and young adults, finding somebody else that they actually will listen to who can insert that doubt or ask questions might be the way to go. If it's a peer, if it's an adult, maybe you can be that voice of asking questions. But what your goal there is not to argue them out of it. Your goal is to stay engaged. I'm curious. Oh, this is interesting. Tell me more. And you're kind of also listening, not so much for the ideology, but what is that ideology meeting? What's the need that is unmet that ideology is filling? And then seeing if, in discovering that need, if there's like something else that you could help them connect to that meets that need in a healthier way. Now, some of that kind of work might require a trained mental health professional to do. And so if you are in a relationship where you could suggest that and it doesn't break the relationship, that might be one path to go. But if maybe they just need somebody to vent to, and and maybe inviting them to, whether it's a dinner with you or if you're practicing a faith, something in your faith groups tend to have strong belief in something bigger than yourself is a protective factor in our field. So connecting people to healthier solutions for that need of belonging or significance, or how do I deal with uncertainty, that can be very helpful if they're in that exploratory phase of this ideology or conspiracy theories. If they're fully radicalized, you're not going to argue them out of that ideology. And in that case, I would not recommend engaging in conversations about the ideology. It's much more maintaining a relationship such that usually what we see when people do exit, it's because they've had some sort of moment where they realize the ideology is actually not meeting their needs. Sometimes it's very practical, like the stories you'll hear might be of like a neo-Nazi who loses their child custody dispute because they have neo-Nazi tattoos. This isn't helping me. I want my child, and the neo-Nazi thing is getting in the way of me being able to access my child. So sometimes it's very, very practical. Sometimes it's more big picture, like, they've been in a movement for a couple of years and like there, that same unmet need, belonging, significance, dealing with uncertainty, they start to realize like this isn't meeting it either. So sometimes it's a big moment, sometimes it's subtle, but they basically tire of it. And what you want to be is the safe person that they can come to and not get judged for the fact that they were a part of something that they're now thinking about leaving.
Wow.
Again, I would say if you are not a trained mental health professional, you are not qualified to help them fully deal with all of the reasons why they were caught up in that movement in the first place. But you certainly can be a safe person where they come to, and then at the proper time, you could say, you know what, could I help you find somebody? Like, it seems like there's a lot to process here. And I really benefited from talking to somebody once. Maybe that could help you. And I'm still here. I want you to talk to me, but I don't fully know how to help with some of this. And maybe somebody who's trained in this could help us. It might take, what we find is it takes a while for somebody to be comfortable talking to a stranger about beliefs that they're now realizing are a little icky or maybe not fully what I want. But you could be that bridge to connect them and just what we know is that it's some sort of accountability. This isn't meeting my needs, and an experience of love. Those two things are usually the two things that somebody that has exited points back to, and they can tell you an example, like really powerful examples of like the black taxi driver who's talking to the white supremacist who's in the car, and the white supremacist saying, I try to kill people like you, and the black taxi driver responding in just such a dramatically loving way that it causes the white supremacist to go, like, maybe I got this wrong. And those stories and anecdotes are few and far between. A lot of times it's not that dramatic of a story, but the two tenets are still there. It's the accountability and it's the love.
Gosh, it's just like tapping down into the deep logic of the universe. And it's so counterintuitive.
It is.
For humans, right? The idea that we would meet hatred with love for the sake of the hater to help them escape it. And I work in this field as well in different, much lower stakes areas. And the data is extraordinarily clear, isn't it? It's like, this is what actually helps, and this is what actually changes people. And yet it's the hardest thing in the world to practice this.
And
you will probably get ostracized by a bunch of other people that think you are enabling and making things worse.
Yes. And there is a fine line. Like a friend of mine she's a licensed psychologist, and she works with people exiting. If you're the parent, you don't necessarily buy your teenage white supremacist a copy of Mein Kampf. That's enabling.
Yeah. You're clear what isn't something that you can affirm, right? Or
So there's you're loving the person, you're not loving the behavior, you're not loving the ideology, you're loving the person, and there are times when some people are not the right person to demonstrate that love for them. Sometimes the parent-teen relationship is really, really difficult to navigate because their job might be to set very firm boundaries to protect other kids in the home, for example. Also, you have situations where for you personally, maybe you have trauma in your own life that makes it really hard for you to engage with somebody with that ideology. That is not necessarily your call. You could pray for that person. You could encourage somebody else to go minister to them, but it is not necessarily your burden. And so I don't think that we're all called to do it all. But where there is a place and you have the capacity to offer that unconditional love for people that on their face don't deserve it, that can be a powerful change agent.
Wow. Elizabeth Neumann, I could speak to you for another hour. I am so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for coming on The Sacred.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's been a joy to be with you today.
Wow. I feel like I just want to highlight the entire second half of that interview in terms of the truth-telling incredibly grounded wisdom that it contained. But I'm going to start with naming a thing that's a little bit uncomfortable, which is Elizabeth was initially setting off some of my prejudices. And we talk about this on the podcast a lot, this predictive processing model of cognition, you can call it prejudices, the way we all have working models of types of people in the world. And people can demonstrate a couple of criteria and then we're like, oh, you're that type of person. And this is embarrassing to admit, but it's because I know that we all do this that I feel able to say it. On first encounter with Elizabeth, I was like, she's blonde. I don't know why that's a thing, but for this particular stereotype in my head, it really is. She's Southern. She worked for the Bush and the Trump administration, and she says, the Lord, a lot. I'm a Christian, right? But people who say the Lord this and the Lord that, and the Lord said this, just like a particular language quirk that I associate with certain groups and tribes. And as so often happens on this podcast, I came in with a particular set of signifiers, right? A particular image of a particular kind of person. And the beauty of it is that always just falls apart before my eyes, and the complex particularity of an individual human person emerges with all of their complexity and fragility and wrestling. And next time I meet a blonde, Southern, Christian, Texan, my model will be more complicated, right? I'll be more open-hearted and more curious. It wasn't that I had particularly terribly negative associations about that model. It was just a sort of character archetype in my head. And Elizabeth has helped invite me into a more complex posture. She said, that was just a great question. What would you die for? Good to sit with. She reminded us that there are no easy answers at the kind of level she's working at. For lots of us, right, I have a lot of sympathy for leaders. I have quite a lot of sympathy for people working in politics. I don't love the default critical posture that, and I have a bit of this in me as well, that idealists often have, that think there's an obvious easy answer and then people just aren't taking it because they're idiots or they're malign. At that kind of level, there are mainly just bad options, right? There is everything involves some kind of compromise. And I think the assumption that we know better or that we could make better choices needs sometimes, not always, sometimes questioning. She spoke a lot about the formation of her childhood and that sense of there being a kind of us and them about the world, and the sad realization that her community, the people that she held dear, the church, which she's got so much succor and nourishment from, and continues to get such succor and nourishment from, had been radicalized, right? She'd been studying extremism her whole career and she suddenly saw it in her own community. That will be the line that stays with me forever. I spent my whole career protecting the homeland, and when someone took the capital, they weren't saying Allahu Akbar, they were saying Jesus is Lord. And it sent her on this journey of trying to figure out why. How do you as a community be so scandalized by Bill Clinton's behavior and then 20 years later not at all scandalized by examples of moral turpitude, just feels like a very American thing they used to put on their visa forms, that far outweigh any of that. And she said the answer is fear. Fear, the desire to be protected, a lust for power. So I sort of want to be asking, what am I afraid of? And how am I allowing fear to change me, to change my life, to change my values, to push me into being someone mainly interested in self-protection, mainly interested in power. I don't want to just always be spotting that in other people. I also want to be asking it of myself and of my community. She also, reading the book and talking to her a little bit, helped me get a more complicated picture of the Bush administration. Basically, I think I was too young to have almost any impression of the Bush administration except that we joked about him being thick, the George W. Bush administration. Thick and malign was how it was presented really in the UK media. And all of these subtleties about a kind of compassionate conservatism, about PEPFAR, which I've now learnt was this massive and astonishing aid program for victims of aid that the Trump administration has killed, to the horror of many of the evangelicals that helped push it through. It's just a more complicated picture of what was going on there. And the other really lasting thing is the formative power of 9/11, this sense that the American story, the myth of America as a place that was a fortress, really, that had never really been damaged from the outside. I guess they experienced wars on their own soil in the way that almost all of the rest of the world has, at some point in their history, was sufficiently rupturing of the myth to change the lives of so many people and to birth this discipline of homeland security, which I didn't even realise had not existed before, and that Elizabeth was fairly key in shaping. And then Elizabeth said that people vulnerable to extremism, not necessarily poorer, not necessarily more mentally fragile, the things that the factors that come up again and again are people who've experienced a humiliation, a lack of significance, and a lack of belonging, and people who are navigating a lot of uncertainty. I mean, the second one is all of us, right? We're all open. We're all vulnerable to extremism in that sense. And if we are not embedded in communities, and if we are not embedded in healthy relationships, we're just leaving ourselves wide open to be manipulated. And this incredibly profound thing that I don't know how to express in a way that doesn't sound soft and cheesy that we landed on is that everything comes back to a lack of love, to unmet social needs, right? That this soft stuff, supposedly, of our neighborhoods being strong and our schools being nurturing and our families being steady, is violence prevention. It's terrorism prevention. That I was also really randomly reminded of the David Cameron speech that was briefly very famous about Hug a Hoodie. It was one of the headlines that really got used against him, and I can't actually remember the whole speech. But that David Cameron was also in this sort of compassionate conservatism tradition. But the willingness to say maybe the response to all these ASBO teenagers, which was the problem at the time, all this antisocial behaviour amongst young men, might not be, we might not necessarily need to be punitive. We might need to see the unmet social needs in them and move towards them rather than away from them. I now see as this remarkably prophetic and profound statement that he got very mocked for. I don't know if the policy was actually good behind it. I haven't checked that up. Ending up working in Trump 1 because someone calls you and says, this line is not secure enough to tell you all of the stuff that's going down here, but I need your help. I can immediately see, I hope someday someone makes a really great drama about all of the people in all the departments trying to limit the harm, trying to protect people and institutions and the rule of law. And this final thing about what we can do individually around seeing people around us be radicalized, or the growth of extremism more generally, just reinforced all these things that I know but is so hard to live, which is bizarrely this combination that sounds it's like love and justice to hold together, which is love and accountability, to be people who are really clear about what we will and won't tolerate, but to somehow do it with care for the person, with an affirmation of their dignity. And crucially, she said, you can't help people exit unless you are a safe person to come to who won't judge them for what they've done. Yeah. Are humans capable of that? Is anyone other than the divine capable of that? I don't know. But, man. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield. The Sacred is a podcast made by Theos And our production team are Lizzie Harvey, Lydia Taylor, Amari Gandrin, and Joe Downey. We're edited by Drew Hawley, and our music is by Luke Stanley. I really hope that you'll I really hope that you will go and check out Theos's wider work, and I look forward to speaking to you next time.